right. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. We're a membership association dedicated to helping public historians put history to work in the world through community building, programs, and scholarship. Thank you for joining us today for the fifth presentation in our six-part series exploring new scholarship related to the World War II home front, facilitated as part of the National Park Service's commissioning of an update to the 2007 theme study on the topic. We've been delving into several topics related to the home front over the past few weeks, and you should be getting recordings of those presentations if you weren't able to attend live. And so this is the fifth out of six. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Matt Basso on disability history in the home front. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. The webinar is being recorded. The closed captions are enabled. If you don't see them automatically, click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please be sure to keep your microphone muted unless you want to ask a live question during our Q&A at the end. And at any time, you can pop questions into the chat area, and I'll note them for our Q&A with Dr. Basso at the end of the presentation. And last, before we really begin, I want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Emily Button-Cambeck from the National Park Service for some words of welcome. Emily?
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, my name's Emily Button-Cambeck. I'm a historian with the National Park Service, and I'm the National Coordinator for the American World War II Heritage City Program. This is a program designed to recognize one city for each state and territory for their contributions to the World War II home front. And I'm really excited to share with you that as of Tuesday, we announced 8 new heritage cities for 2024 in 7 states and 1 territory. And so this is an exciting week for us, lots to share. And we're really excited to have Dr. Basso here to share more of the work he's been doing as part of this NHL theme study update. And this project is one of several projects that we have pursued in partnership with the National Council on Public History in order to share new scholarship about the World War II home front, help heritage cities, parks, and other heritage sites to nominate sites that are associated with them that this new scholarship can help us to look at in new ways and recognize different aspects of how World War II shaped American society. So I'd like to thank Stephanie and thank Dr. Basso for the work they have done bringing this project to near completion. We hope it will be published soon, as well as to thank Selena Moon, who is an editor as well as a scholar of Japanese American and disability history, who has also made a lot of contributions throughout the course of these projects. Thank you very much. And I'll turn it back to Stephanie to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I should note that Selena Moon was scheduled to present with Dr. Basso today, but was unable to join us, but we thank her for her scholarship and support of this project. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Basso once again for another excellent presentation. Matt Basso is an associate professor of history and gender studies at the University of Utah and the author of Volume 2 of the National Park Service's World War II and the American Homefront theme study. He is the author or editor of 4 other books, including Meet Joe Copper, Masculinity and Race on Montana's World War II Homefront, and his current monograph project uses New Zealand history to consider settler masculinity through the lens of work and war. In collaboration with his students, he's partnered on public history projects with the NPS, Forest Service, Smithsonian Institution, Utah Humanities, the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, and other state and local organizations. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Basso, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, as always, Emily. It's been a real pleasure working on this project because of the great team of folks at National Park Service and National Council for Public History, and also the grad students here at the University of Utah, undergrads as well, and elsewhere, including Selena Moon, who I'm sorry can't join me today. But I'm excited to talk about the disability history of the World War II home front. It's an area that it's just incredibly important, and there's a lot of scholarly possibilities for it. There's also a lot of possibilities for nominating sites. So let me go ahead and get started with that history. The main slide here that you're seeing as a title slide simply says Disability History of the World War II Home Front and my name. I am a middle-aged white man with a goatee, and I will be speaking throughout this presentation. I will do my best to describe the slides as I go along. Okay, so this is our first kind of body slide, if you will, and it says FDR in Warm Springs, and it's a picture of not yet President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1929 at Warm Springs. So most of you know that FDR was partially paralyzed due to polio. He's a critical part of the World War II homefront disability story because he was the most powerful and famous disabled person in America. His relationship to disability during the war years, much like the nation's, was complicated and related to the pre-war era. And I'll try to make those links somewhat apparent as I go along, though I'm going to focus on the home front. I should note that the chapter that this is based on is quite long and very much makes more of those links between both the pre-war period and the post-war period. It also draws on excellent scholarship from a variety of scholars, including National Park Service scholars. I'm going to mention a couple of them, but they're all fully cited in the chapter. So myth has it that while FDR was doing official duties during the Great Depression, he did not like to be photographed using his wheelchair or in any other way that revealed his paralysis and reliance on assistance. This notion is based on the assumption that Roosevelt and others in the United States believed disability represented weakness. Whether that's the case or not, National Park Service researchers at his home in Hyde Park have found little evidence to support this claim. And indeed, we do have images of FDR in his chair. Franklin Delano Roosevelt established a therapeutic center at Warm Springs focused on polio in 1927. The design of the grounds and buildings guided by Roosevelt made it accessible to wheelchair users and normalized disability. It became a place where disabled people felt welcome, forged friendships and community. He also supported research and treatment for disabled people. But Warm Springs represents the contradictions that Roosevelt embodies for homefront America and its disability history. The hot springs and treatment offered relief, and it helped some disabled people develop community, as I noted, but that community was only available to an elite group of the disabled, which for the vast majority of the Depression and the war did not include working class or non-white people. Likewise, in the 1930s, as he was building out Warm Springs, his administration, the Works Progress Administration, specifically refused to employ disabled people on relief work, prompting famously the League, at least within those that study disability history, the League of the Physically Handicapped, to conduct one of the first significant disability rights protests. So this contradictory history that FDR represents is very much part of the argument that we want to put forward. I want to put forward with this chapter. Research on the World War II home front disability history is relatively new, but scholarship reinforces the conclusion that, as Kim Nielsen argues in A Disability History of the United States, quote, World War II had a profound impact on the disabled community as a whole. More than 10 million Americans became temporarily or permanently disabled through military and workplace injuries during the war. Organizations focused on improving the lives of both those disabled before the war grew, and new organizations were founded during the war. These developments and the need for disabled people to participate in the labor force increased attention on those with intellectual, sensory, and physical disabilities. The result was an array of new government and business policies. The war also created new therapeutic approaches and dramatically expanded the national infrastructure for rehabilitation. However, it is too simplistic to say that there was only progress. Disabled people and their allies hoped the conflict, with its call for all citizens to contribute to the war effort, would do much to eliminate the discrimination they faced. They hoped the distinctive context of the home front could prompt improvements in treatment, accessibility, and views about disabled people. But like the president, the reality was far more complex. This presentation, and as I've noted, the essay it's drawn from, contends that homefront disability history and the organizations and its sites associated with it shows the societal perception that an individual's ability to work determined their worth, and that perception grew during World War II, particularly on the home front. This standard tended to further marginalize disabled Americans, but the need for workers mentioned previously provided an opening for them and advocacy organizations to demand changes in attitudes, policies, and practices. Because the war was an engine for disablement, veterans groups and labor unions joined disability advocacy organizations like the newly formed American Federation for the Physically Handicapped and became ever more important voices in shaping disability discourse. Like the AFPH, they emphasized the need for vocational rehabilitation programs and the importance of access to paid work. Several issues segmented and sometimes divided the homefront disability community. One was whether military personnel and veterans should receive more attention and assistance than those that were civilians. Another was how ability was linked to gender and race. Like the able-bodied community, ideologies of masculine and white supremacy shaped the disabled community. These ideologies and the practices they engendered limited the ability of organizations, the government, employers, and society to change. Connecting work and individuals' worth also excluded intellectually disabled people. And the image in front of you is an argument slide and shows a group of workers taking a guidance test in 1945, a group of what some scholars call mentally disabled. Okay, the roadmap for the rest of this presentation, as I've just given you the introduction. I'm going to introduce you to the protagonists of this story. I'm going to focus on the idea of rehabilitation, which was a central theme of the home front. I want to talk about the disabling power of the home front, in other words, of home front workplaces. I want to talk about work on the home front and its relationship to citizenship. Then I'm going to use government employment as a case study. There's many other case studies in the fuller chapter. Intersectional identities around gender and race and disability are the next section of my presentation. We're going to shift then to military service and its relationship to disability and focus in on military and VA care facilities. Finally, we're going to talk in detail, time permitting, on mental disability and psychiatric care with a conclusion wrapping things up. Okay. As I've noted, I want to focus first on the protagonists. The federal government is first here for the various reasons that they typically feature in presentations like this. And while I'm going to talk about some rehabilitation policies and legislation, I want to start with the draft, and indeed with the peacetime draft. The peacetime draft began in October 1940, and it became, as we've noted in other presentations, the primary way the government and Americans assess the relationship between war, work, identity, and in this case, physical and intellectual abilities and disabilities of male citizens. Officials designated the Selective Training and Service Act, which mandated that men register for the Selective Service System and guided its operation, with the nation's previous experience with veterans in mind. That is, that the design of it had veterans in mind. And this is a point that many scholars have expanded upon. For instance, Civil War veterans very much shaped Congress's late 19th century response to disability support. And that disability support became a major issue, primarily because of the budget that it took up. In 1893, for example, officials calculated that approximately 41.5% of the nation's budget was supporting a little under than 1 million veterans or their dependents. In World War II, the selective service system aimed to reduce the likelihood that the government would have to care for disabled men by tightening the screening of potential conscripts for physical or psychological conditions. Evaluators screened a remarkable number of men, 18 million. Often poorly trained, these evaluators barred men for a host of physical reasons that shaped American society's views on ability and disability. They also ascribed neuropsychiatric disorders and emotional problems to many of the men they screened. Ultimately, 970,000 individuals would be deemed to have issues so significant on that latter category that they were barred from service. Roughly another 1.5 million would be discharged from the military for neuropsychiatric reasons. And as we noted last week, the draft screening process linked disability with identity in a variety of different ways. Queer identity, for example, was linked to neuropsychiatric disability, as we discussed last week. Men who were not in uniform were often denigrated as 4F. The draft classification, which denoted a candidate was physically, mentally, or morally unfit. Again, make sure you pay attention to this language. Some disabled men were frustrated at being included in the condemnation of men who were not serving, believing they would be an asset to the military. One deaf man said, quote, "I felt a little injustice. I wanted to join, but I was told that I couldn't because I'm deaf." Hearing people who didn't want to join were told they had to, but many deaf people felt that they could serve. If some hearing people wanted to get out, we would have been happy to take their place, end quote. The government's place in this story is going to be reinforced several times, but now I'm showing a slide about disabled civilian advocacy organizations like the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped, an incredibly important organization discussed especially well by Audra Jennings in her excellent scholarship. So the AFPH, which emerged in 1940, was headquartered in Washington, D.C., had branches throughout the United States. And although organizations like the National Association of the Deaf and the National Federation of the Blind were active during the war, the AFPH was distinctive for not focusing on one physical disability or identity group and for its prominence on the home front. Founder Paul Strachan, I think I might be mispronouncing that, I apologize, who became disabled in a car accident in 1929, believed in mobilizing the collective power of a wide variety of disabled individuals. As he put it, quote, "The blind, deaf, hard of hearing, those with cardiac conditions, those with tuberculosis, arthritis, epileptics, those with poliomyelitis," again, apologize for the pronunciation, "those with cerebral palsy, amputees, and diabetics should work together." This big tent model of disability activism, this inclusive model, however, had limits, especially around issues of race and around mental disability, as again, Audra Jennings has spelled out. Next protagonist, veterans organizations. I'm here showing a picture from the American Legion magazine from September 1943 that shows multiple generations of veterans, and now this new generation, the World War II generation, entering the picture as a major force, but also one that the American Legion wanted to make sure was taken care of. After the US entered the war, these veterans organizations emphasized the plight of former soldiers. They joined the AFPH in playing a significant role in framing views about disability. As noted, they were led by veterans of previous wars. Other organizations besides the American Legion included the Veterans of Foreign Wars and Disabled Veterans of America. Their focus, importantly, became ensuring that disabled veterans received better support than they had, and sometimes this meant being in conflict with civilian organizations. Okay, I've switched slides to focus on the evolving, as I note, war-long push for rehabilitation by these organizations in conjunction with the federal government and state governments, but also critically pushed for and led by disabled Americans. So the civilian advocates like the AFPH were more concerned with the government creating a national rehabilitation program to bring disabled workers into war production jobs faster. Veterans organizations, on the other hand, wanted the government to focus first and foremost on making sure that veterans were going to be taken care of. This and the federal government's own infighting led to a very slow process for vocational rehabilitation, especially when you consider that in 1941, in December of 41, Paul McNutt, then head of the Federal Security Agency, was already in conversation with President Roosevelt, who wanted to see a program that would help get physically disabled civilians and military veterans into the wartime workforce immediately. His reasoning was the same given as trying to get other marginalized working groups into the workforce. And that was, of course, the need of the arsenal of democracy for more workers as able-bodied men in particular left for military work. The debate about the bill centered on notions that rehabilitation would provide disabled Americans productive capacity or earning power, that's a quote, so that they could be independent and self-sustaining instead of, quote, remaining objects of charity and victims of pauperization and paternalism. So you can, again, hear the language and the centrality of work in this language about who would count as a worthy disabled person in the United States. Both veterans organizations and disability advocacy organizations castigated the government throughout 1942 for slow progress. The AFPH, for example, said, quote, "Why cannot industry and the public generally realize that we too aspire to the comfort, the feeling of security that comes from fair recognition of our rights as citizens and our needs as handicapped?" Here you see really a powerful enunciation of rights discourse. You'll see on the slide a picture of men being rehabilitated and in a rehabilitation office. And the slide also notes that the first of these two rehabilitation laws, they were split, one for veterans and one for civilians, was passed in March of 1943. And then the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, which was for civilians, in July of 1943, a couple of months later. All right. During that fight itself, it became ever more clear that the need for rehabilitation was going to be critical, not just for those that were going to be disabled through military combat and military operations, but also, and not just for civilians who had been disabled prior to the war, but also for those that were going to be disabled on the home front. Workplace injuries, long a scourge in American industry, had fallen, statistically speaking, the number in latter years of the Great Depression, but that pattern changed in 1942 and 1943 as new factory workers received substandard training and factories failed to focus enough on safety. This is corporations that were driven by the desire for profit, a point that I linked to militarization and shifts in the American mindset in our very first presentation on environmental history. The image you see here is a wartime poster. It says, "Don't get hurt, it may cost his life." Intriguing, again, centering of the soldier and the importance of the military mission over the home front worker. This illustration, by the way, is from an excellent set of web pages put together by Jade Ryerson for the NPS on the disability and the World War II home front. I can't recommend those enough. So the AFPH received an important support from organized labor in its fight to get rehabilitation for disabled home front workers. As one AFL representative, Louis G. Hines, noted to a panel, quote, "A great many of these disabled folks are members of our organizations." The crossover between the AFPH and the AFL and CIO was an important part of advocacy on the home front. Many different publications, it's worth noting, including Fortune magazine, called out bosses and corporations for not treating safety and the possibilities of disability seriously enough. Fortune wrote, quote, When management takes the overzealous view that production must be achieved at all costs, accidents are in the making. So this growth in the number of disabled Americans because of home front work impacted several factors of the disability story. During the first year of wartime mobilization, and not incidentally of full employment, the government placed only 28,000 disabled individuals in jobs. By 1945, driven by demands by civilian and veteran organizations, and by these greater number of Americans being disabled on the home front, they were able to place 300,000 disabled individuals into industry and government work. It was clear that the government and industry were more willing to employ disabled people in a range of jobs. Notably, the number of disabled people working on the home front was much higher than these figures. The New York Times, for example, estimated that 3 million disabled Americans were working on the home front in 1942, and added the number is constantly increasing as the able-bodied are called to colors. One reason that employers were willing to hire disabled workers was a return in popularity, in part to the intervention of vocational rehabilitationists of World War I era approaches to placing disabled workers in industrial jobs that suited their abilities. I say much more about this in the essay and note, as have other scholars, that Ford Motor Company was a leader in this and in shaping this particular approach. Okay, I've shifted over to a slide that says the Department of War and Government Employment. I want to use this as a more in-depth, albeit brief case study about the employment of disabled men and women on the home front. The picture is from a film still put out by the government employing disabled workers in industry. This film is available on YouTube, and I strongly urge you to watch it. It's a pretty great primary source. The War Department illustrates the variability in how organizations handle disabled workers. On one hand, it launched a campaign seen in films like this, depicting disabled men doing a range of tasks in machine shops and other heavy industries, and disabled women sewing, operating telephones, and performing other secretarial tasks. Yet the War Department's homefront military bases were themselves slow to accept disabled employees and never employed a sizable number, paralleling what occurred at many wartime workplaces. When the War Department did hire disabled workers, they quickly showed their worth. At Brookie Field in Alabama, for example, which had 17,000 civilian employees, the management hired 11 blind trainees in 1943. Their effectiveness at their jobs motivated base officials to hire workers who were hard of hearing or deaf, paraplegic, or used prosthetic limbs. The Charleston, South Carolina Navy Yard also did similar things, as did many other Department of War employment sites, but not nearly enough and not to what the department itself said needed to be done. Okay, again, this is expanded on in the chapter. I've focused in my commentary, as you can hear, primarily on men, but at this point, I want to make sure that we understand disability and the experience of disabled Americans as very much an intersectional identity. So here there's a photo of a disabled man working on a lathe. This is a pretty famous photo. And I want you to see not just his male body or his disability, but his whiteness, right? The role of race in providing access and the role of gender in providing access to workplace was very much the same for disabled Americans as it was for able-bodied Americans. For men, the idea of gaining full employment, disabled men, was very much wrapped around the idea of being a breadwinner. John Millard, who had been rejected from jobs for 8 years prior to the war because employers did not trust that a man with artificial legs could be an asset, and that was a quote, highlights the role of local and state agencies in providing employment and the gendered arguments put forward by those agencies and disability organizations. The role of local and state agencies, let me stop and say, is an area that we need much more scholarship on and is hugely important to this home front story. So the Cleveland Placement Bureau, in the case of Millard, helped him land a job on an assembly line, and he quickly earned the reputation as, quote, an efficient workman. The company added 5 other disabled workers soon thereafter. His position, the Bureau noted, allowed him to once again fulfill his responsibilities as a breadwinner for his wife and 6 children. As Sarah Rose in her excellent disability scholarship notes, and as Millard shows, an individual's experience of disability was again deeply intersectional. Disabled women had their possible employment far more circumscribed, not just by their disability, but also by their gender. This is a picture of white women who are working in Milwaukee, and this is another website that I want to alert you about. This is Sarah Palicki and others' really excellent repair website, which is an ArcGIS story map website that's really excellent. And this is a piece that Sarah did about the Milwaukee Ordnance Plant. Now, for disabled women who were eager to find employment, they were eager to do that for both pride and a sense of self-worth, but also patriotism, and often to sustain themselves and their families. So Mary Curtis, a former student at Gallaudet College, the country's foremost institution of higher education for deaf and hard of hearing people, found clerical work at the Pentagon. After that, she helped construct fuselages for B-29 bombers. Suggesting the ways that disabled people have been erased from home front narratives, Curtis told an interviewer well after the war, quote, "It's not in the history books, but I'm the deaf Rosie," end quote. Many deaf women could have contested this claim, again, as Sarah Palicki's research on the Milwaukee Ordnance Plant shows. And that story is partially told also in the chapter, but again, I urge you to go check out the repair website. I want to turn to race, and I've switched the slide here to one that's titled Disabled Americans and Race. And here there's an image that was put together by Nubi Eli from wartime incarceration of deaf and hard of hearing. And this very much speaks to Selena Moon's really excellent research on the experience of Japanese and Japanese Americans, disabled Japanese and Japanese Americans in incarceration camps and in other sites. So the vocational rehabilitation community, it's critical to note, made their ideas about race clear in the policies they supported and enacted. It was whites they intended to help. Most disabled advocates reinforced the idea of white normativity and tacitly supported white supremacy, if not overtly. These were positions that were also reflected in government policy. In the fall of 1944, for example, Helen Keller spoke to Congress about the discriminatory education that deaf and blind Black students were facing on the home front. This was building off of a critique put forward by the Black community regarding educational opportunities for all Black children with disabilities. And this was a critique put forward already by the 1930s and earlier. I should note that I speak more about these topics in the essay that is part of volume 2, and that I speak more about the racial politics of places all across the country, including Warm Springs. Okay, I'm going to keep on going, being cognizant of time. I've shifted now to, after talking about these kind of identity politics, about talking about the protagonist of the home front and talking about the home front and work, to the disabling power of military service. And that's the title of this slide. The image is of a team of paralyzed World War II veterans who the Smithsonian Institution, in one of their articles, contends were the inventors of wheelchair basketball, and that's what this image is of. The increasing number of men disabled by military service affirmed the military's concerns, as well as those of the American Legion and the VA, and the government's decision to quickly start building new care facilities. By mid-1944, 200,000 discharged veterans had been approved for disability pensions. More than 5% of those were assessed as totally disabled. Combat intensified from D-Day on, which increased this number dramatically. By the time Japan surrendered, 678,000 US sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines had been wounded or injured. Of those, 44% had been hospitalized and received convalescent treatment. So with that as a backdrop, it's important to recall, of course, the specific things that war does to bodies and minds. Both the military and VA officials were expected to run out of capacity because of what war did to bodies and minds of soldiers. The military was on a tighter clock and responded creatively because they would be the first that dealt with these injuries. Initially, they relied on facilities like the Bethesda Naval Hospital, one of the last of their facilities to emerge from the pre-World War II approach to military healthcare. They also purchased civilian treatment centers like the Kellogg Sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, which became the Percy Jones Army Hospital in 1942. By 1945, it was the largest medical facility in the world, serving over 11,400 patients and specializing in amputation, eye prosthetics, neurosurgery, physical rehabilitation, and deep X-ray therapy. The military also repurposed Army barracks like those at Fort McPherson, Georgia. They modified other buildings like the Breakers Hotel in Palm Springs, Florida, and we say much more about this approach in the essay. Finally, they built many new facilities. Pictured on this slide is the Bushnell Military Hospital in my own backyard. This is in Brigham City, Utah, which was built in 1942 by employing a large workforce who lived with community members. The 235-acre facility cost $9 million and consisted of 60 buildings that could house 1,500 patients. Sadly, this facility is no longer there. Some of the military's facilities, like Valley Forge General Hospital in Pennsylvania, did specialized treatment. It, along with Letterman Hospital in San Francisco, focused on treating ocular injuries. 3 dentists posted at Valley Forge in 1945 created a new acrylic artificial eye, for instance, that was much more durable than the old glass eye prosthetics. The military rehabilitation story is a critical part of home front disability history. But so too is that of Veterans Administration facilities, which were very much active on the home front. If wounded soldiers could not be returned to their units, after they were discharged from military care, they entered the VA system for additional rehabilitation. Given the escalating rates of disablement, the VA became increasingly important. Initially, the VA used pre-World War II medical facilities, like the large hospital at Ellis Island and the one at Allen Park in Detroit, and that's what's pictured on this slide, one of the older VA facilities on the home front. But expecting substantial demand post-war, it began building new facilities. Some of these were like the second generation buildings that you see here with Allen Park. Others were third generation hospitals, and under General Omar Bradley, the VA rolled out a remarkable number of these. Whereas second generation hospitals were most often located in a countryside setting, because doctors believed that restorative care and rural spaces went together, third generation facilities were more often in urban spaces. These new facilities were usually designed as large towers instead of sprawling campuses, though there's a variety of different models for this. Bradley called for 183 new hospitals, an extraordinary expansion. 100 of these hospitals were operating at the end of the war. These new enlarged capabilities treated almost 13 million veterans who entered the civilian population by June of 1946. Okay, now I'm turning to veteran psychiatric care, and here I've got an image of one veteran comforting another after combat. And this is an image, remarkable image from the National Archives. Of the approximately 800,000 US soldiers who saw intense combat during World War II, the military admitted 74% for psychiatric care. 37.5 had such serious trauma that they could no longer effectively function in military operations. In total, 1 million men faced debilitating psychiatric symptoms. Ironically, these men proved the fallacy of the predisposition theory, which led large numbers of men being rejected during the conscription medical exams. Instead, it was combat, or more broadly, the environment, which came to be considered by psychologists and other medical experts as the determinative factor for most neuropsychiatric issues. Mental disability more broadly on the home front is the title of this slide, and I'm showing a picture of a special report in Life magazine, Bedlam 1946, by Albert Q. Meisel. The subtitle of this important expose was "Most U.S. Mental Hospitals Are a Shame and a Disgrace." I speak more about this history in the volume, and I want to emphasize, though, a few points. The lack of investment in civilian psychiatric care that helped define disability history of World War II was rooted in pre-war patterns, though therefore, of course, we see both continuity and change on the home front. Rather than sites of treatment, state institutions, variously called hospitals or mental asylums, confined people with mental illness. In 1900, these institutions had on average one doctor for approximately 137 patients. By 1943, the ratio was 1 for 277 patients. This is part of the eugenics history of the United States, the notion of removing misfits from society. And as David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, two of the numerous disability scholars I cite in the essay, these individuals, these misfits, were warehoused, their term, in institutions. The war pulled more men into uniform, and this was part of the dynamic of the staffing crisis. By the end of the war, some citizens were paying attention to this, like Albert Meisel in this expose, and several journalists linked this to the treatment of folks in these institutions to concentration camps. One important group that helped shed light on this history were conscientious objectors who chose employment in mental hospitals as their wartime service. Almost 3,000 strong, these COs advocated for the mentally disabled in a really important book called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, which describes the criminal conditions and was a topic that, because of them, was picked up by Eleanor Roosevelt. All right, I'm now turning to my conclusion, and pictured on this slide is a very famous image, maybe the most famous image of disability associated with World War II, and that's of Harold Russell, the disabled veteran who was the star of The Best Years of Our Lives. It also shows the actress Myrna Loy. In 1945, as we go to a summation of the history of disability on the home front, non-disabled Americans were perhaps more aware of considerations for disabled people than at any other time previously. But the public focused on disabled veterans, not the hundreds of thousands of home front workers disabled during the war, nor civilians disabled independently from the war. Rehabilitation experts, for their part at the end of the war, were confident that with new technologies and these new protocols, quote, the vast majority of disabled veterans could successfully readjust to post-war society as productive citizens, end quote. That's from John Kinder in his very important book about disability and veterans. Prosthetics were part of the public representation of technical advancement, and you see that in this picture here. But if technology promised to ease adaptation, to civilian society again, how family and community members treated disabled veterans was a significant potential obstacle to their readjustment. The VA and the government blanketed the home front with information about how to help veterans adjust to civilian life, including disabled veterans. It's worth noting that not all communities decided to incorporate veterans back in the same way. Native American communities, for example, used a different approach. They continued their long-running practice of reintegrating veterans through ceremonies and a return to indigenous webs of being, even in the face of ongoing settler colonialism and the economic, political, and cultural structures that made reservation life sometimes deeply challenging. We say more about this story, of course, in our Native American and Indigenous history chapter. Even with the nation focused on them, though, disabled veterans proved far from immune to the problems the American Legion and the AFPH at the beginning of the war predicted would characterize the post-war experience. Work was the most fraught issue. Major General Gravesby Erskine, who commanded the Marines who had fought at Iwo Jima, partnered with AFPH and with the Secretary of Labor to protest and compel change on the part of industry. He reminded employers that over 80% of industries had employed disabled people during the war, and he compared them to their non-disabled colleagues who often skipped work and left their jobs, arguing that disabled workers did so less often and had equivalent or better production records. Yet post-war disabled veterans and workers who had been so successful in the home front were being slighted, the general said, in favor of the worker with no disability. The conditions for workers, for Black disabled workers and veterans were even worse, which I mention again in more detail in the essay. Divisions among disabled people and disability organizations didn't help. I talk about those, but most especially the medicalization in the approach to disability, which came to characterize the post-war, was a real hindrance to structural changes in society and to ideological changes around ideas associated with disability and ability. Ultimately, World War II era disability rights organizations garnered enough support from society and the state so that some disabled people, primarily white veterans and physically disabled male civilians, did not feel as forgotten as World War I veterans. And with that, I will stop. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that fantastic presentation. We have some questions coming in and I will start running through. I also want to share for folks that there are several fantastic resources that Matt mentioned in his talk that some of us have been trying to keep in the chat. So please do scroll through those. And if you're interested in saving them and want to look back at them later, you are able to save the chat if you click the three little dots to the right of the chat window and click Save Chat. And those include Jade Ryerson's prior work and Selena Moon's link. Thank you for pulling those links, everyone. Mark Canavera also asked about the recordings for previous lectures, so I included the playlist for all of the recordings there, and we will add this one and next week's as well. Now, Alicia Hayes put into the chat, I used to live in a condo that was in the former Bushnell Military Hospital. Or it became the Intermountain Indian School. 2 buildings from the original hospital are condos. Others are an antique store, some storage, etc. Over 100 buildings were torn down. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Matt, about the preservation of these sites and sort of what you've experienced in your research there.
No, thank you so much for mentioning that. And yes, I knew about Intermountain, of course, a remarkable history. But I didn't know about the other ones. The only thing I'll add is that there's just really important work to be done documenting military and VA rehabilitation sites and care facilities. It's, I think, often thought of as post-war history, and certainly it is, but it's also home front history. And I think a really important chapter and a lot of cool possibilities for research in that area, as well as potential preservation. So thank you for bringing up Bushnell.
And I'll also remind people who might not have access to the chat, if there is anything or any links or any follow-up you would like to see, you can email ncph@iu.edu, and I will find whatever links it is that you need. And I'll also remind folks that you can use the chat to type your questions, but if you prefer to ask your question live, you can use the raise hand feature, which is under React on your Zoom screen, and we'd be happy to let you ask that way as well. Sarah Lee wrote in the chat, "Thank you for covering this topic. I was excited to learn about beekeeping classes taught to soldiers during the war who were disabled or disfigured. It was the hope that they could use these skills to create a livelihood while giving the option of having more privacy for those who didn't want to be as visible in public. The mental and emotional benefits were also emphasized." She also adds, "There's a military hospital in the Northwest that was a hospital farm with farm animals that recovering soldiers helped to take care of, which helped with emotional and psychological recovery." I don't know if you have anything that
I
you'd like.
do. Thank you for mentioning that. I talk in the essay, borrowing from other scholars, or Rose in particular, about the Rome Plan, which some folks on here might know about. This was very much an agricultural approach. Often it took disabled folks out of asylums, so-called asylums, and brought them together in community to do the work that they could do around farms, beekeeping, a bunch of other sort of stuff. And they were interdependent on each other as well as others. It harkens back to almost a pre-industrial approach to integrating folks with disabilities into workplaces. So super cool. And yes, in lots of different countries, that rural work was central to their vision of how to rehabilitate veterans. Thank you for that.
We also have a question from Tatiana Moore, who says, "Thank you for this presentation. In doing research for my master's thesis on the Sioux Ordnance Depot in Sydney, Nebraska, I came upon several mentions of the National Employ the Physically Handicapped Week in post-war era. The depot actually won a national award for its employment of people with physical disabilities after the war. Did you come across any other military facilities that did do well in generating opportunities for the employment of people with disabilities?"
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned ordnance work. Ordnance work, as Sarah Pelicky and others have noted, was pretty popular as a place to employ deaf workers and others as well, but deaf workers in particular. The story in Milwaukee was their ability to communicate with each other and not get rattled by the noise, to communicate with each other using ASL, for example. But there are other sites that certainly employed disabled workers, military sites, and we've got a fair number of photos of that. In addition, that week that you mentioned was kind of a World War II initiative and was part of the government trying to push employers to do better on the part of employing physically disabled in particular. And as I noted, the War Department just had a really spotty record of that. So some places great, some places are not great, I wish. Some places okay, but many places really terrible.
Thank you. We have another question from Kay Routley, who asks if you could speak to how we were able to guard against bias during the research process with your team, noting that ableism can creep in, and they're curious if people with disabilities were involved in any sort of intentional process with the research.
Thank you for that question. That's an excellent question, and really important as far as how able-bodied folks should think about methodology. We were not focused enough on that. I focused on it some, but I have to thank other people for that. That's National Park Service historians who did a great job of reminding me of that occasionally. Folks like Selena Moon, who also did a great job of reminding me, and one of my own colleagues here at the University of Utah who runs disability studies, who frequently reminded me of this. So I was intentional, but intentional enough? Absolutely not, right? Need to be a much more centered, focused, and much more rigorous process. So thank you for that reminder. I want to do better, and I'm hoping that folks listening to this and that are going to keep on doing this work, including based on sites, will focus on that very issue.
Thank you. We have another note in the chat from Alicia Hayes, who says, if you look on YouTube, there are videos of the vocational training programs at Bushnell. The hospital had landscaped grounds. Gardening was part of the PT. There was also a pool and bowling alley.
Thank you again for noting that, right? There's so many amazing resources out there. This again reminds us of those points of continuity. These essays that I've written are trying to show the distinctive aspects of the home front and what the home front changed. And we certainly do that, but continuity is absolutely critical to a more nuanced and accurate history. And here again, this link to kind of rural or to kind of working in the environment, not just in industrial type settings, as ways to rehabilitate veterans in particular and get them rebalanced, at least in the minds of psychiatrists and such in the World War II era. This was an important tool, though they often turned to medicine as well, as lots of folks here know.
And now we have a question from Mark Canavera, who says, the idea that psychological trauma was so widespread that it shifted thinking in the field about psychology is fascinating. What are some major shifts in conceptions of disability that occurred in the prior period, i.e. in the interwar period?
That's a great question. And I'm glad that you picked up what you picked up from my comment. I want to elaborate on that, and I'm going to come back to the other part of your question. One of the really interesting parts of this is a shift to mental health. So there's all sorts of mental health campaigns following the war that I think are very much linked to the end of the war and to ideas about veterans and what society can do better, for good or ill, I should add, because a lot of times those mental health initiatives were not structural, right? They were about kind of attitude and so on. But to your earlier point, what were the shifts prior to the war that we can identify? There's a couple, but the one that I'll focus in on for a moment is a more integrative approach to treating folks with disabilities. And this was especially around veterans, right? So the VA coming out of World War I started doing more with trying to do occupational therapy and other physical therapies, as well as kind of workplace training, as well as neuropsychiatric rehabilitation. So that integrative approach, which wasn't really around prior until the post-World War I era, becomes much more popular in the Great Depression and very much shapes the home front approaches that I speak about in the essay. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And that brings us right. Oh, we got one more comment and then we'll wrap it up. Missy Hermes says, the Fergus Falls State Hospital in Minnesota continued to publish a newsletter called The Weekly Pulse for patients and staff during World War II. It's a rich history detailing how this community participated in rationing of all types, wrote poetry and songs, gave blood, purchased war bonds, enlisted or left hospital employment for defense work, and much more. Cadet nurses received neuropsychiatric training there. Some of the residents in hospital were World War I veterans, and by 1943, World War II veterans were being admitted.
Thank you for noting that. Again, so many great sources out there, and many of them cultural, right? So, kind of a focus on the culture of that disabled Americans produced is a really cool angle on these stories. These sorts of newsletters are around in a bunch of places and absolutely critical to save. I should note that Selena Moon showed me several of these from internment camps, which are just incredible documents and super interesting as well. So there really are kind of a cache of primary sources out there that are going to help us tell more nuanced, more complete histories of the World War II home front and the experience of disabled Americans. And I, for one, am excited to see that work. So thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. And as we've hit the top of the hour, I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today, for having such fantastic questions and additions to this amazing research. Please join us again next week when we explore Latino history of the home front. Same time, same place, Thursday, 9/24 at 3 p.m. Eastern. And that will be the conclusion to this series. But again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Basso, for all of your research and for this fantastic presentation. And I hope you all have a wonderful end of your day.
Thank you, Stephanie.